Hello, I'm Des Fagan, and today I'm going to talk about artificial intelligence and urban typologies. So just a bit on my background. I've been an architect for going on 15 years now, and my most recent role was that of project architect for the London 2012 Olympic Village. And before that, I worked at a few other places, including Zardeeds as project architect for this project, the Glasgow Transport Museum. Currently, I'm Head of Architecture at Lancaster University. I'm also part of the excellent research group Imagination Lancaster. So my work looks to unpick the ways in which the authorship of the architect or designer will change during adoption of computer processing, primarily machine learning and its application to architectural design. For example, I'm currently testing ways in which machine learning can mediate between the pressures of heritage conservation and commercial development for under threat UNESCO World Heritage Site buffer zones. Today, however, the title of my presentation is Between the Promenade and the Seafront, a generative adversarial network methodology for the transposition of architectural style towards a new building typology in Morecambe. In the first section, I'd like to give a general introduction to the problem I'm trying to solve, and then discuss what machine learning and GAN means in the context of this work. I'll go on to discuss what I believe is a new typology in architectural design, then explain my results and describe my future work. So, on to the problem. Morecambe is a small town on the northwest coast of England. It lies in close proximity to the city of Lancaster. Large areas of Morecambe are, however, some of the most deprived in the country. The town has become victim, alongside many other seaside towns, to the impact of seasonal tourism, multiple housing occupancy and lack of government investment, amongst others. The beach fronting onto Morecambe Bay is the main focus of the town, made famous for its flat fishing, mainly plaice and cockles. The promenade itself is an eclectic collection of buildings that represent some of the better decades of Morecambe. The Midland Hotel, some of you may know, a Grade 2 star listed 1933 Art Deco style building restored by Urban Splash in 2008. The Morecambe Winter Gardens, built in 1897, another Grade 2 star listed building on the promenade, originally home to seawater baths, a sauna and ballroom, and of course the auditorium itself. And there are glimpses of 1950s and 60s American style amusement arcades too. This is the Pleasureland building, still managing to keep open with recent investment to introduce a modern bowling alley and an amusement arcade. But alongside these glimpses to the past, there are perhaps more frequent reminders of the lack of investment by both government and local council. So Morecambe really is in dire need of investment, the kind of investment that unfortunately it failed to gain as part of unsuccessful applications to funds like the Sea Change Fund in 2009 and more recently the Future Towns Fund in 2020. And that is where the Eden Trust entered into the conversation. So Eden in Cornwall has contributed something like $2 billion to the local economy, and it's welcomed more than 20 million visitors in since it fully opened back in 2001. It celebrates plant life in different climates afforded by the hermetically sealed biodomes that provide shelter amongst the quarries of the existing Cornish clay pits. The Eden Trust vision is to have a sister scheme that celebrates all sea life in the north. Drawn to Morecambe due to its rich seaside legacy, it plans, with economic backing from Lancaster City and County Council, to make the vision happen, and soon. The location is here, a prime spot on the seafront, adjacent to the Morecambe Hotel and opposite the promenade. It's located on land that used to be made up of huge open sea baths. And this is the design from Grimshaw's architects that were released, I think, back in 2019. a series of buildings that make reference to the shells, particularly mussel bed shells, that line the shores of Morecambe Bay. Now, the architects have made clear that the building is still an outline design, but the aspirations are for the scheme to reflect the rich sea life of the bay. It's quite clear that the design of the proposition is very different from the existing context. Now, I say this not to be critical in any way of the scheme, rather just to recognise that the function and scale of the proposal is very different from that of its close surroundings, very similar as well to the Cornwall Eden project. So how does one design in this particular circumstance? There's a clear desire for the building to reflect the form and shape of seashells on the bay, but there is of course equal concern of trying to make the building fit in with the context of Morecambe. And really this is a problem common to many architects and designers of buildings. How do you build between two competing sides that might be different in character? How do you build the in-between, navigating the need for new design but taking into account patterns and materials of the existing? This is a problem that raises a multitude of questions: heritage, planning, economic viability, and community decisions amongst others. I believe the problem described provides an opportunity to utilise machine learning. So machine learning effectively enables the deep learning of the visual character of a building's context. This learning can then generate a synthesized amalgamation that speculates on new structures or buildings within that context. The method I outline in this research has potential to learn the patterns, textures, details, and shapes of Morecambe, both Promenade and Seafront, in order to inform the building of the new Eden North. What it does is it affects a form of intercalation of the sea life, i.e. the seafront on the left, and the town, the promenade shown on the right. But what are machine learning and generative adversarial networks anyway? Well, machine learning is available to a wide audience today through increased efficiency of computing processing power. Some call this artificial intelligence. I think that is somewhat controversial, but machine learning learns from trained datasets of information. The particular type of machine learning I'm discussing in this research is called a generative adversarial network. Now this involves two networks effectively fighting against each other. So one generates images, in this case here the number 8, the other tells whether the generated image is fake or not. They both train at the same time, with the generator trying to fool the discriminator and the discriminator trying to catch the fake data. So a good analogy is between a forger and a detective. And the end goal is that the forger gets so good that the detective can't tell anymore. And with this, we can then get the forger to output things that are very similar to the original or to the original dataset. In this example, images of multiple numbers. So as an example, this is an illustration of the Pix-to-Pix HD GAN generative adversarial network, which allows both semantic learning alongside features learning. In this example, the GAN model is trained on a dataset of 400 images, mainly from Paris. On the left, the user is able to draw any combination of rectangles for windows, doors, balconies, and cornices, and the program outputs a guess of what it thinks that building might look like on the basis of the learning already completed on the 400 images of facades. And as a reminder, machine learning through GAN networks isn't just for building design, it's actually a much widely used application, and the field of application includes retail, health, geographical information systems, or GIS. In this example, Pix-to-Pix is used to generate shoes from a line drawing following the training dataset of 50,000 shoe pictures. Speaking of GIS, or geographical information systems, GANs are used in this application here to speculate on what a Google map might look like as an aerial view, and vice versa. So the paper speculates on the application of GAN to then go on and locate natural resources from map data, including watercourses and mineral deposits. A useful example of GAN in architectural design is researcher Stanislas Chalu's 2019 work on generative floor plans called ArchiGAN, where he amalgamates the learning of thousands of datasets of human designed plans by applying a trained program, Pix-to-Pix HD, to a new context. In this instance, in order to generate new designs for delineation of apartment floor plans. The value of this work in particular is in proof of concept, but also in learning from the human intelligence already applied to the design of the datasets. So here the GAN has been trained on thousands of existing apartment floor plans, indicating the likely area and locations of rooms with varying external wall and window configurations. So you can see that as the walls and window locations move, the model suggests where most rooms from the thousands of datasets have positioned themselves to respond to these locations. This particular example works by building on the intelligence of the designs of the original dataset. So if most of the designs in the dataset position, say, the kitchen in a specific location in relation to a window, this new model will reflect this if asked how it would predict where the kitchen should go given the same window location. But the researcher doesn't just stop there, he also experiments with other datasets too. He applies stylistic changes to the floor plan. So in this example, he uses a dataset of Victorian typical housing plans to train a GAN, which then alters an input to suit that of Victorian architecture with the output on the right. This is the Baroque dataset, so using Baroque church plans. That then synthesizes new plans to pick up the Baroque unique column and wall geometries typical in the style. And finally, an example of two-story housing as style transfer. I think it's worth noting with all of these examples really that they use freely available datasets that are not specific to place or to location. The datasets are often universal, and it's often rather difficult to trace where they come from and what explicitly they mean in the context of the training. And so on to section 3, a new typology, hyperlocal vernacular. So going back to the slide earlier referring to hyperlocal vernacular, perhaps you may be able to understand a little bit more easily now why I'm describing this as a new typology. It's the first time that anyone has described a methodology that learns from a bespoke local dataset contextual to the location of the target. So the previous examples shown rely on machine learning using universal datasets, which might originate from any part of the globe or in any application. So of course bias is a concern and the origins are unclear. So what I propose is the creation and training of a bespoke local dataset, and this hasn't been trialled before in this application. The clear benefit of this approach is both in the veracity of dataset origination, but also in the geographic relevance of the dataset to the target. And this is particularly important, I think, for contextual building. So on with the method, and let's start with the Promenade side. So the Promenade is characterised by the strong bank of buildings described in the earlier chapter. The location of Morecambe is shown here. The site of the Eden project is located here in red. And in terms of my approach to the dataset, I decided to test a dataset that took into account the facades of the Promenade from approximately 1 kilometre either side of the target site. So although a relatively arbitrary measurement for a first test, it did also coincide well with the natural start and end of 3-storey buildings and above along the Morecambe Promenade. In order to record the images, I set up a high-definition camera recording at 60 frames per second within my car and drove down the promenade on the route shown. And as you can see from the model, which was kind of designed and compiled separately, the promenade building height is relatively consistent, so I was able to relatively easily use the camera to record the full height of the facades along the route. It's worth mentioning as well that I was able to obtain many of the original drawings of the buildings recorded, just to verify the relative scales and heights to ensure that features were translated appropriately. So for example, this is the section of the Winter Garden showing this incredible auditorium currently undergoing refurbishment. Drawings of the Pleasureland building referred to earlier, and these are obtained from South Ribble Planning portal. And here the Queen's Hotel on the promenade too. And what these drawings did was help me to stitch together the photos and to put together a fuller picture of heights and features. And this is what the promenade looked like in 2 sweeps. And this is the individual dataset with images taken from the video chosen on the right. I discovered that 4K and 60 FPS recording of video were really key to ensuring that I was able to take suitably detailed still images from the video, which would then contribute to the dataset. And so, onto the training of the data through the GAN. For those interested in my setup, I was using Google Colab with an NVIDIA A100 Tensor Core GPU with pix-to-pix HD running from GitHub at 2024 pix squared. So this one ran for 100 learning epochs in total and took about 8 hours. So on the left is the input, which is the black and white lines. In the middle is the synthesized image or the guess from the training of the software, and on the right is the real image. So as you can see, as epochs move forward, it's beginning to pick up more and more features. It's getting the color right. So generally it's moving to a more accurate and defined definition of the buildings as training increases. And this GIF isolates the synthesized images shown over the 100 epochs from 1 to 100, and you can see here how it begins to improve with accuracy of texture, detail, form and color over the advance of the epochs. And so once the GAN is trained, it's always trained. You can input anything to test it. So for example, here taking this image of London, a typical London end of terrace house, what might that look like if we test it against the full building trained dataset of the Morecambe Promenade? Well, it looks something like this. It reflects the texture and colour of the Morecambe Promenade well. It picks up and identifies the windows and doorways, also the separation of roof from facade. I think with greater definition and further training with a greater number of epochs, I'm sure this will improve the definition of features greatly. Another test on a block of flats in London. Again, this Morecambe training data on the flats transposed reflects the texture and colour of the Morecambe Promenade. This is a typical mid-terrace in North England, and this is what the GAN methodology generated as a synthesized image. It's perhaps a little more clearer than the other examples, picking up features and roofline and the chimneys very well. And so on to the other side, side B, the seafront. We know that the Eden project are very interested in exploring concepts of scale and representation of shells and sea life in building form. So for the second dataset, the seafront, I decided to explore the concept of hyperlocal vernacular further by playing with scale, much like the architects were playful using the mussel shell inspired design of Eden North. As such, I decided to collect and scan in as many shells as I could find along the Morecambe Bay area by using my phone as an RGBD scanner, then replacing the shells back onto the beach. And on scanning the shells, I then used the software Blender to set them up and to render them from the top, sides and bottom of the shell in as high definition as I could, providing 4 views of each shell, which you see here. And this turned into quite a large data set in the end. This GIF, similar to the other, isolates the synthesized learning over 50 learning epochs, again at 1024 by 1024, and hopefully you can see that as epochs move forward, the veracity and the accuracy of the data increases as well. So on to the results. So if we now apply the Morecambe trained Promenade dataset to the Eden North project, we get the following outcome. So we're looking first at the Promenade side or the building side. So as you can see, the output identifies the shape and form of the project well, along with texture and colour. There's some indication of definition of existing features taken from the Promenade, but perhaps not as many compared to some of the examples of application on the more tangible building types like the London end terrace shown earlier. I believe that an increase in training epochs from 100 to perhaps 200 will go some way towards improving this, and further work will identify parallel methods for the improvement of definition. And so on to the second trained dataset, the seafront and the shell dataset. Let's see what this looks like applied to the Eden North project. So perhaps unsurprisingly, it's generated a rather well rendered and textured representation of what appears to be mussel shells, closing the circle somewhat on what the architects may have originally been planning. So here I think the definition is really strong, and it goes some way to explaining more generally how machine learning can also help with the taxonomy of classification through minimal input information. In this case, a simple line sketch of the shape of the Eden project in the first instance. So a very strong result that bodes well for the accuracy of the shell seafront dataset. And so on to future work. I think the logical next step will be to now combine datasets to discover what, for example, a 65% seafront and 35% promenade might synthesize the Eden North project as. This has the interesting effect of providing more emphasis on one side versus the other. So what if it was mainly Seafront rather than Promenade? What would this look like or even mean? A second piece of work would be to look at the scope of the dataset. So what is the right amount or number of data to provide for an ideal dataset for hyper-vernacular building design? So is it to go wider in order to give greater definition to the synthesized images, or is it better to go narrower to more streets in the town in order to give greater accuracy? I think the methodology asks interesting questions about authorship of the architect or designer and how buildings may be designed in future. If a simple line drawing by anyone can produce highly contextual building design through machine learning, this clearly has serious potential in software design for future software application. Particularly as all the examples shown today have been limited to just 1024 by 1024 pixels in a really very early GAN software development. Extrapolate up the technological advances to processing power and software development from the last 10 years forward, it wouldn't surprise me if this approach does not become well adopted in future. So I think it will become widely adopted in future building design. And I think the research has application to heritage conservation efforts. So for example, one of my parallel projects, I'm looking at the problem of UNESCO World Heritage buffer zones. So the zones between World Heritage sites and new developments that risk the status of the original site if development is not sympathetic to that heritage. This problem, for example, has plagued the UNESCO Mercantile City in Liverpool in recent years, shown on the left, the blue line is the buffer zone. And that's primarily due to the pressures of economic investment and building tall versus respecting the heritage status of the dockland area. So how do you mediate between these two sides? And finally, building on this point, and in conclusion, I believe the method may in future provide a useful tool to allow stakeholders to co-design new schemes or to plan new areas in cities by varying the existing data set of the city to try to strike a balance between competing priorities. So, for example, in the example given, a data set might be altered to option the design of a new building between multiple stakeholders who decide to emphasize community design and zero carbon features with pre-1950s architecture that surrounds the site. And that brings me to the end of my talk.